Although the auction industry is by nature one of the most sustainable industries that exist, much remains to be done to meet environmental requirements. Today we talk to Tom Woolston, Global Head of Operations of Christie, about their net zero vision. Under your leadership, a year ago, Christie announced a global sustainability initiative. Can you outline Christie's commitments and goals for a more sustainable future?
Well, firstly, thank you for coming today. Welcome to Christie's, and thank you for asking me to participate in this podcast. It's great to talk about this subject. Yeah, we launched a little over a year ago now our sustainability commitment, and it was comprised of three pillars: commit, communicate, and collaborate. The commit part of that strategy is an ambitious pledge to achieve net zero by 2030, and in so doing reduce our carbon emissions by 50% across all parts of our business. We also committed to the Science Based Target Initiative, and were happy to be validated by them at the end of last year. So that's the commit part of the strategy. That's the decarbonisation part of our strategy. The communicate pillar of our strategy was things like this, using our brand and our leverage, our platform to raise awareness around sustainability to help drive change across the market, which leads to the third part of it, the collaborate part of it, which is that we can't do this alone. And systemic challenges like this one need collective action to find solutions.
True. But who was the main driver behind your commitment initially? What was that, internally or externally?
I think there are three things that I will say to that. The first is questions around why or where did this come from, I think are important, but increasingly I think the important question to ask is why not? Why are companies not doing this? So the sort of glib first thing I would say is it's the right thing to do. Ethically, it's just the right thing to do, and all companies should be doing it, and increasingly are, I believe. And that's particularly important for us because we do have a leadership role. We are quite a big organisation in the art market, and so we felt a responsibility to play a leadership role in helping to drive change in the industry. The second thing is I think it's pretty visceral to the business that we're in. We are in the art market, and art is so often inspired by nature. It was Bonnard, wasn't it, who said that art cannot exist without nature. So I think it's pretty visceral to our business, to the work that we do, and to our stakeholders. It's something that's very natural for them to be interested in. And speaking of stakeholders, I think that's the third key source that I would point to, is all of our stakeholders, whether that is our clients, both sellers and buyers, but also our staff increasingly want this. In particular, as we see our client demographics shift to younger generations, and in particular as we want to attract young talent, this is absolutely an absolute imperative for any organisation to do.
True. So what is Christie's impact on the environment currently?
So our current carbon emissions for 2021, we've just completed we're just dotting the I's and crossing the T's on our 2021 carbon report. Our current emissions are 25,000 tonnes of carbon or thereabouts. And very broadly, they are created by four main sources. There's lots of miscellaneous, but if I try and categorise it into four main chunks, the first is our infrastructure, our built infrastructure, so the buildings that we're in, like the one we're in today, or our technology, our technical infrastructure, the IT, the website, and so on, all the digital infrastructure that has to support it. So that's the first big source of our emissions. The second is our shipping. Logistics, transport from a seller to Christie's, internally within Christie's. Obviously we're a global organisation with sales rooms all over the world, so the internal logistics can be quite significant. And then finally, shipping from Christie's to buyers. The third is our business travel. We fly around the world, we have important relationships with collectors around the world, and we have to carry out our expertise and appraisals around the world, looking at works of art. So business travel has historically been a really important part of what we do. And then finally, publishing. We have historically created a huge amount of print media, and the printing and distribution of sale catalogues, of auction catalogues, has been a really significant part of our emissions. So whilst there is lots of miscellaneous categories, if I was to simplistically categorise our emissions, those would be the 4 areas that would make up the majority of our emissions. Thinking about it a little bit more technically, and I'm not a sustainability expert, I should hasten to add, but there are technical definitions for sources of emissions called emission scopes, scopes 1, 2 and 3. Scopes 1 and 2 relate really to the emissions associated to the energy that you consume as a business. Either you burn fuel in your own engines, your fleets of vehicles, or your factories and so on, or you procure energy from the grid, the electricity used to turn on the lights in your building. They're scopes 1 and 2. Scope 3 is really everything else. So it relates to the indirect emissions coming from all the goods and services that you procure in your supply chain. And we, like I think all participants in the commercial art market, our footprint will be dominated by scope 3 emissions. And for us, probably about 85-90%.
What are the biggest contribution or contributing factors that lead to emissions in the auction business? I mean, you said it now, but do you think that's in general also for the competitors?
Yeah, I think so. I think that those 4 pillars that I described, the built estate, your buildings and your infrastructure, the shipping, the travel, business travel, and to a lesser or greater extent, depending on the art business, your print media and the marketing activity that supports will be the 4 main sources of emissions. Yeah.
So with so many moving parts to an auction business, it can be difficult to accurately calculate one's impact on the environment. How does Christie's measure its impact on the environment today?
Well, it's an exceptionally good question and a really, really important one. It's really hard. I think of it as trying to run a commercial organisation and achieve stringent profit targets, whilst at the same time building from scratch pretty much a financial accounting system. In effect, that's what we're trying to do. We haven't historically captured our operational information for the purposes of reporting carbon. So the effort to properly understand all your operational activities and equate them to tons of carbon is fearsomely complicated, but really, really important. It cannot be overstated how important that is as a first step. For the art market, for the commercial art market, we're quite a big organisation, we're quite a complex organisation. And furthermore, as I already mentioned, we've applied to the Science Based Target Initiative that really is the gold standard for net zero targets and for measuring carbon. And so rightly, they have very rigorous and detailed standards to adhere to. So for those reasons and more, we work with specialist environmental consultants to help us map all of our operational activity and equate that into tons of carbon emitted. That's been a really important exercise for us because it has informed all of our operational activity and the whole sustainability program. But of course, not all organisations are as big and as complicated as Christie's, and there is a lot of resources online, freely available online, to help unpick your carbon footprint. The Gallery Climate Coalition, for example, has a freely available online carbon calculator, which is well worth a look.
In one way, you could say that the auction industry is one of the most sustainable industries there are, actually.
Recycling. We've been recycling since 1766.
Exactly, yeah. No, and that's an honor, right?
Yeah.
But auction houses often tend to market their enterprises as sustainable, invoking the circular nature of the secondary market, as you say.
Yeah.
But we know that, like any other business there can be significant impact on the environment coming from the auction industry as well.
Yes.
So how does Christie's ensure transparency when talking about their environmental impact?
So another good question. Transparency is really important. It's critical for establishing trust and creating accountability, measuring your emissions and being open about what they are is vital to any credible sustainability program. But it's hard. I mean, we're a private company, we're a competitive commercial organisation. We're not used to sharing all. we're not used to opening up and not just talking about the things that we happen to be doing well or our successes, but talking about the things that are a challenge. But that's where the good stuff is. That's important to do. So it is a bit of a leap of faith. We published last year our first environmental impact report. You can look at it on our website, it's freely available there. And that details all of our carbon emissions and what's driving it. And it charts our progress towards achieving our targets. And we will be producing that every year. We're just about to produce our report for 2021 in the coming week or two, I hope. And as I said, we'll be doing that every year going forward.
In fact, in a press release that Christie sent out about a year ago, you have pledged to be net zero by 2030.
Yes.
How far into that journey are you?
Funnily enough, we have achieved our objective. In 2021, our emissions of 25,000 were 25,000 tonnes of carbon, are half, roughly, of where they were in our baseline year, which is 2019. However, clearly COVID, the awful horror that has been COVID, has had a lot to do with that. And we fully anticipate our emissions to rebound this current year and next year as trading conditions increasingly normalise, in particular things like freight and travel. So we've achieved our 2030 goals, but we're going to have to work hard to maintain them and to reduce them again once things normalise. And I think therein lies the challenge. You know, we taking the lessons that we've learned from COVID and inserting them into our business as usual way of working in the future is going to be the great challenge, not just for us, but I think for businesses generally.
And I mean, you have obviously your strategies that you implemented to reduce your carbon footprint, but is carbon offsetting involved in that?
Well, offsetting is implicit in a net zero target. So the formal definition of a net zero target is firstly reducing emissions in line with climate science, a credible scientific basis to credible decarbonisation. And once you have achieved that, to then sequester the residual emissions that you have left through carbon removals. That is what net zero is. So at some point we will be offsetting. But I think all of the decarbonisation activities that we're currently working on, so all of our strategies, the programme initiatives that we've got, they require investment. They require investment of time, management time and attention, resources, money. And I think that's where the priority needs to be for businesses, is to not use offsetting as a kind of early fig leaf. I think the idea of just carbon neutrality, in other words, carrying on as normal, but balancing your existing carbon with offsets, has rightly been debunked and widely been debunked. So I think offsetting historically has been abused a little bit in that way. It is important. Climate science, from what I understand, is unequivocal in asserting that in order to achieve the goals of the Paris Climate Accord, in order to achieve keeping global temperature rises to within 1.5 degrees of pre-industrial levels, carbon removals are necessary. So I think there's no argument that this is important, but for us, we want to prioritise our resources on decarbonising, achieving structural reductions in our carbon, and then we will offset.
There has been a shift on focus on sustainable models across all industries. How do you see the art world is mobilising to target the issue of climate change?
Well, it's wonderful to see the amount of dialogue now compared to even a few years ago has just transformed. Interviews like the one we're having now, conferences, panel discussions, articles. I think generally the dialogue about sustainability has increased really significantly, and I think that is an enormously important thing. But what we're also seeing is much more organised collective action. I think actors across the market coming together in an organised way to work on shared challenges. And a great example of that is the Gallery Climate Coalition. I mentioned it a wee bit ago. They are a brilliant organisation, we're proud to be members, who have brought together actors from across the market that are completely agnostic in whether it's auction or gallery or whoever, to raise awareness and to provide resources and information to its members. And it's if you haven't looked at their website, it's really well worth visiting. There's a ton of really useful information, and we're proud to work with them and help them in that mission.
We're operating in a very competitive landscape, but you have previously stated there are no competition when it comes to sustainability.
Yeah.
Referencing in the fact that collaboration is key. How can the art market work together towards reducing its footprint?
That's right. I think if you accept the premise of the climate crisis, then it follows that you want all actors, even your fiercest rivals, to be exceptional at this. I mean, why would I want Sotheby's, for example, to be producing more carbon than us? I mean, it's mad. So I think really understanding that there should not be competition here. This is not a point of competition. This should be a point of shared endeavour, is the important first step. I think once you've cleared that sort of psychological boundary, which again, we're a competitive industry like other competitive industries, it's not easy. But once I think you've cleared that boundary, there are lots of ways where you can come together and cooperate to find solutions for problems. A good example is we're just about to launch a program to develop sustainable shipping standards, such that if within our supply chain, a provider of fine art logistics wants to work for Christie's, they're going to need to adhere to the standards that we set out. And we're not going to do that in a Dickensian way, where we need to, we understand that many of our suppliers who are excellent experts at fine art logistics, who we rely on greatly, are small organisations, but they need the confidence that we can give them through standards to make the investments and the innovations that they need to decarbonise their own businesses. And through shipping standards, we can, and the heft that we've got in our buying power, we're responsible for, 20, 30 million of fine art logistics spend a year, not just on our own account, but on behalf of all of our clients. That's a big force for being able to drive change in that industry. And I think, we're not going to do that in isolation. We'll work with our suppliers, we'll work with other stakeholders across the industry. But it's a good example of how you can work with others, you can collaborate in your industry for a common good, for common benefit.
But about the shipping and freight and transportation, do you think there will have to be a limit to global trade if we want to be more sustainable?
Shipping is the hardest to abate source of our emissions, I think. So it is difficult, but it's not impossible. We are, for example, looking at ways we can reduce our shipping emissions through using less carbon intensive modes of transport. We launched recently with Crozier Fine Arts, one of our shippers, a monthly sea freight container service between London and New York, and we're going to extend that to London and Hong Kong. And all other things being equal, shipping a work of art by sea freight between London and New York is something like 80% less carbon intensive than shipping the same work of art by air freight. So there are ways that we can rely on less carbon intensive modes of transport. And I think we do need to ship less too. One of our biggest strategies that I can easily point to as part of our decarbonisation programme, our sustainability programme, has been the enormous shift to digital. Now let's not dress that up solely in the cloak of sustainability. There's lots of reasons why we did that, lots of good commercial reasons, but it's been a huge benefit to sustainability, and we have noticed that online auctions in particular need much less internal shipping than their live auction counterparts, because that's the whole point of an online only sale. You don't need to ship something to New York to physically sell it. You can sell it from anywhere. So we do need to ship less, and we can ship less. I'm not convinced that top-down prescriptive quotas are the right way to go to limit trade. I think companies want to be more flexible than that. We have a target, in a way that's like a quota, but we also have the flexibility to know that, look, it's a global target for all of our business. We will achieve that. In some areas, we're going to well exceed that target. In other areas, we'll find it a little bit more challenging. But overall, we'll get to where we need to go. And I think you need to give companies the flexibility to manage their decarbonisation according to the needs of their business. It does need to still be a commercially successful and profitable business after all, and a very blunt instrument like trade limits might not be helpful.
You mentioned the difference between shipping overseas or by a freighter or aeroplane shipping. What is the obstacle? Is it the speed, the time that it takes, or are there any other reason why we don't ship more overseas today?
Well, I think part of it is habit, and part of it is the provision. We feel that there is an opportunity for a lot to go by sea freight, and we're prepared to invest, even if there is spare capacity and it doesn't make, it's loss making for us early. It's never going to be profit making, but even if we have to invest up front with a supplier like Crozier to create the capacity and therefore stimulate the demand, we will do that. So it takes somebody to come along to say, listen, we're going to put on this monthly service, and it may only be half full or even a quarter full for the first 6 months, but we'll get there. It takes somebody to come along and be prepared to do that, and that's what we're doing. I think people need to come to terms with a change, and don't forget, we're shipping very expensive, unique works of art that it's a very emotive part in the client journey. It's a very sensitive and delicate part of the client journey. Insurers need to be confident that this works and that this isn't too risky. So I think there's lots of work to be done to build confidence in it. But we are convinced that this is a really viable way of shipping. And interestingly, we see a lot of people increasingly interested in it. The time factor is not so great as you might think it is. Shipping by sea freight between London and New York is 3 weeks or so? Well, there's plenty of things that don't need to be there the next day.
Exactly.
So I think managing people's expectations is a part of it too.
No, I totally agree. Do you have any tips to give to other auction houses who are just starting to think about shifting to sustainable practices? Since, once again, this is not a competition.
Yeah. Well, look, it's not for me to say, it's not for me to tell others how to run their business. All businesses are going to face their own unique challenges and their own context, and they'll know best how to manage their business. I can certainly share some insights that we've learned that have been helpful to us. I think, firstly, top-down leadership is vital. It's absolutely vital. We've been very lucky. Our chief executive, Guillaume Suruti, has been incredibly passionate and supportive about this, as he has been around other parts of environmental and social governance at Christie's. And so too, for that matter, has our shareholder. So having top-down support is really important. But having buy-in more generally across your business is also important. You look to your colleagues, you look to people who understand the different parts of the business to come up with the solutions that will help you to achieve your targets. So, and in particular from energetic younger generations in your business who believe in this passionately and want to make a difference. So leadership and buy-in, I think, is the first thing I would point to. I would go back, secondly, to the comment I made earlier about the importance of measurement preceding management. I will just say again, getting that solid foundation of understanding of where your emissions come from and why is a real commitment, and it needs to be gone into seriously, and needs to be maintained. Year on year, we will get better at this. We're not perfect at it by any stretch, and we are committed to for the long term making that work really well. And then thirdly, I think you've got to be bold, and you've got to be brave, and you've got to make an ambitious target and do it publicly. Even if you don't know how you're going to achieve that target. When we set our targets, quite frankly, I didn't know how we were going to do it. We still haven't, to be clear. But I knew some of the things that we needed to do, of course. But you don't have all the solutions yet, because many of those solutions may not have been invented, and the context and the paradigm isn't there yet to deliver on them. But you have to contribute to that momentum, and you do that by aggressive targets. The sum of all achievement of those who have set moonshot targets but missed them is still far greater than the sum of achievement of people who don't set ambitious targets. The target itself, the ambition of the target itself, should be the source of momentum and energy that you need to move along. So I think being ambitious, stating a target and doing it publicly is a key element of this as well.
One of the major trends that made the turnover in the art world increase tremendously last year was NFT. Obviously.
Yeah.
They've been praised for providing an accessible entryway for art ownership, and there is an exciting prospect for NFTs to be used to track a work's provenance and releases in the future. But however, we also know that the blockchain is incredibly energy intensive. So what do you think the future holds for NFTs in the context of sustainability?
That's a good question. We were proud last year to have played a role in perhaps bringing NFTs to new audiences across the art market. We had the market shifting moment when we sold Beeple Everydays for $69 million early in the summer last year. And as you say, we were also proud of many of the benefits that NFTs bring with them in democratizing the art market, in breaking down barriers, and so on. But of course, we're also aware of the fearsome energy intensity of blockchain and all of the subsequent environmental issues. Before I answer, a point of context, we sold last year around 90 NFTs, and we asked our consultants to come up with a methodology to try and measure the impact, the carbon impact of those, which is incredibly difficult to do. There is no consensus yet on the methodology for measuring NFTs. It's incredibly hard to do, but you need to start somewhere. And in good faith, they come up with a methodology which we've used to measure the end-to-end impact of those 90 odd NFT transactions. We think that the order of magnitude of those emissions, not all of which is within our operational boundary, I might add, is around 40 to 50 tons of carbon. So as a percentage of our overall annual emissions of around 25,000, it's infinitesimally small. It's a fraction of a percent. But it is important. Of course it's important because of the role that we have played in bringing these NFTs to perhaps new markets, and also because, of course, more broadly, they are really energy intensive and problematic. So we do take this very, very seriously. I think many of the actors on that stage, the digital artists, the creators, the buyers, are oftentimes very creative people, very resourceful people. I hold out quite a lot of optimism that I think the future of NFTs, the future of blockchain, will become sustainable. I am not, by any stretch of the imagination, a technical expert on blockchain. So ask me to explain the technology behind it, I flat out cannot do that. But I do know that the proof of work methodology for blockchain is the thing that drives the energy intensity. Banks of computers solving complex algorithms in order to participate in the blockchain. Shifting that by design to something like a proof of stake methodology all but neutralizes the sustainability concerns of blockchain. And I think that will happen. I hope that will happen. We are adding our voice to the voices of others in calling for that to happen. And I think in the meantime, we will continue to report on this very transparently, in spite of it being just a tiny percentage of our emissions. It is high profile, and it is something that many are rightly extremely worried about. So we will continue to report on this as a sort of separate section within our annual environmental impact report, so people can be completely clear about precisely what it is that we're doing there.
There is so much a single business or a single industry can do on its own. What innovations would you like to see implemented across other industries that would help your mission?
The invention of electric aircraft, commercially available electric aircraft, that would go a long way to helping us out, wouldn't it? But it would go a long way to helping a lot of people out. I think beyond that, I'll try and answer that in quite general terms. I think the big challenge that we face, and the big challenge that we all face, not just at Christie's, not just in the art market, and not just in the economy, but us as individuals, is regarding resources as precious. We're used to, again, individually and as companies, in cost constraints and cost accounting, making decisions through the lens of what we can afford to do. We're not yet used to carbon constraints and carbon accounting and making decisions through the lens of what we can do on that. Cost constraints are important for the short term, but carbon constraints are much more important for the long term. And I think the great challenge that we have is making that culturally normal. So your day-to-day decision-making, whether you are an individual or a business, is at least informed as much by carbon considerations as it is by cost considerations. And I think creating that as a cultural norm creates the context, it creates the conditions where innovation prospers. Necessity is the mother of invention. Creating that as a day-to-day cultural norm, I think is the big challenge facing us, and I think that would make all our lives a lot easier.
Maybe you already answered this question a bit, but last but not least, what's next? Are there any initiatives we should keep an eye out for?
Well, look, I could spend a considerable amount of time talking about all the many operational and even strategic things that we're doing to embark on our program. We are only in year 2. We launched last year. 2019 was our baseline year. 2030 is our target year. So there's a lot that we've still got to do. If I think of what's really at the top of my list of things to do, that's kind of interesting, and I think will have, I hope, quite far-reaching benefits across the market. We're just about to launch a sustainable packaging program. This is important when it comes to carbon emissions. The weight of packaging contributes quite significantly to the emissions that come from air freight, for example. But it's probably more important when we think about waste and the use of resources. So it really is important for us. Shipping fine art around the world, as you'll know, is complex, it is technical. Works of art need very specific handling and materials, and the materials that are used for packaging have to be calibrated very precisely to deal with that, and quite rightly, quite importantly, these are precious objects. But there's a lot of work to do to identify more sustainable materials, to use less packaging, to understand the different use cases of packing, and what is best for each use case, and to create a much more sustainable methodology including reuse and so on. So I think that's pretty exciting. Rather like the broader shipping standards that I mentioned earlier, this is not secret sauce just for Christie's. You know, we are working with stakeholders across the industry, not least, of course, our suppliers, to develop these, and I would love to see them more widely adopted. And you know, I don't think this is particularly groundbreaking or innovative. There's a lot of work that's being done by many people on this. But for us, I think we again, with our buying power in the market, we have the opportunity to start to really create some momentum on that. So that's something that I'm pretty excited about for this year.
Just as Tom said, it is in everyone's interest to do everything to improve the sustainability aspect of the art and auction industry. With new, younger generation of buyers and sellers, the possibility of success increases. But, as always, demand must come from customers, and initiative and understanding must come from the top.